This is my true story. I never thought the boy I raised with my own hands would one day treat me worse than a stranger. All my life, I worked, saved, and sacrificed so my son could eat well, study well, and live a life without struggle. But one night at the dinner table, my own son told me to wash my own dirty dishes and eat leftovers from his children's plates. That night, I stayed silent. But the next morning, I went to my lawyer. Before I tell you what I did, tell me where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe so my stories reach more people. From the moment my son was born, my whole life turned into one purpose: to give him the things I never had. I grew up poor, working the fields before I was even tall enough to reach the handles of the tools. My own father died young, and my mother carried us through hunger and hardship with her bare hands. I promised myself my son would never know that kind of struggle. Every job I took, every extra shift, every coin I saved, I did it with his future in mind. When he was just a boy, I worked long hours in the factory, my hands blistered and my back bent, so that he could sit in a warm classroom instead of on the cold ground. While other men drank away their wages, I counted mine carefully, setting aside enough for his school fees, his books, his uniforms. I remember his first car. He was so proud, standing there with the keys in his hand, showing it off to his friends. What he never admitted to them was that it wasn't his money that bought it. It was mine. I had skipped replacing my old winter coat, worked extra weekends, and pulled from my small savings just to make sure he had something reliable to drive. I wanted him to have dignity, to feel he was moving forward in life. Later, when he got married, I didn't just stand by and clap at the ceremony. I paid for most of the expenses, the hall, the food, even helped with the rings. And when it came time for him to settle down, I gave him the biggest gift of all, a down payment on his first home. That house, the roof he still sits under today, was secured because I signed the checks, not him. Even after retirement, when I could have held my money close and lived simply, I still contributed to the family fund. I told myself, this is what fathers do. They keep giving, no matter how old they get. I thought the day would come when my son would look at me and say, "Thank you, Dad. I see everything you've done. I respect you." I believed gratitude was only a matter of time, because how could he not see it? Every brick in his path was laid with my hands. But what I learned later is that sometimes the more you give, the less people value you. He didn't see my sacrifices as love. He saw them as obligations. He didn't see my support as generosity. He saw it as something owed to him. While I still saw him as my boy, he saw me only as an old man whose usefulness had expired. At the time, I couldn't see it. I kept giving, because giving was all I knew. I believed one day he would return my love with respect. I was wrong. At first I didn't notice the change. Or maybe I noticed, but I didn't want to admit it. My son had once been warm with me, respectful, quick to laugh at my old stories. But little by little, his tone shifted. It wasn't sudden like a door slamming shut. It was gradual, like water dripping through stone until the cracks appeared. It began with small comments at the table. "Dad, you eat too slowly. The kids are finished and we're all waiting." He would laugh after saying it, as if it were just a joke, but the sharpness was real. Or he would sigh when I asked him to pass me something, muttering, "You always need something, don't you?" His wife never corrected him. In fact, she would smirk, and sometimes even add her own remark. "He takes up more space than the kids," she said once when I asked for a chair cushion. They laughed together while I forced a smile. At first, I told myself it was stress. He had a job, a family, responsibilities. Maybe he was tired. Maybe he didn't mean it. I tried to excuse the little slights because I couldn't bear the idea that my son, the boy I had worked my whole life for, was truly beginning to resent me. But the cracks grew deeper. Soon, it wasn't just words. He started treating me like an extra mouth to feed, as if my presence in the house was draining him. I remember one evening, he sighed loudly as he set down my plate at dinner. You know, food isn't free, Dad. You should remember that. The children looked at me curiously, and my face burned with shame. I thought about all the meals I had skipped decades ago so he could eat, and now he was telling me I was a burden at his table. Then came the chores. At first, he asked me lightly, "Dad, can you help fold the laundry?" I was happy to help. I thought it was his way of keeping me useful. But soon, it became commands disguised as helping out. Wash the windows. Clean the porch. Take out the trash. These weren't requests, they were assignments, and when I was slow, he grew impatient. "If you're going to live here, at least do something useful." Those words cut me deeper than any chore ever could. The worst part was the way he looked at me. Not with love, not with the warmth I used to see in his eyes. It was a look of irritation, as if I were clutter in his home, something he had to tolerate rather than someone he cherished. And the grandchildren, they noticed. Children copy what they see. They began rolling their eyes at my stories, cutting me off mid-sentence, laughing at the way I chewed or moved slowly. They were learning from their parents that Grandpa was not someone to be respected, but someone to mock. Still, I stayed quiet. I told myself, this is temporary. He's under pressure. He'll come around. I swallowed the humiliation because I wanted to keep the peace. I told myself that silence was love, that enduring was my duty as a father. But in truth, every quiet moment was another piece of my dignity slipping away. And yet, even as the cracks widened, I clung to the belief that my son loved me. I thought maybe I was just being sensitive, maybe I was reading too much into his tone, but deep down, I knew. Something had shifted in him. Respect had been replaced with irritation. Gratitude had been replaced with entitlement. And love had been replaced with something colder. The cracks were there, spreading across the surface of our relationship. I ignored them as long as I could, but cracks left unattended always lead to collapse. It happened on an ordinary evening, one of those dinners that should have been warm, filled with laughter and simple conversation. I remember the smell of roasted chicken on the table, the chatter of the children, the clinking of forks and glasses. Everything looked normal from the outside, but inside there was a storm I didn't yet see coming. I had taken my usual place at the far end of the table, where I often sat quietly, listening more than speaking. I was content just to watch the children giggle, to hear the noise of family filling the room. For me, those moments were reminders of why I had worked so hard all my life, so my son could have this picture of comfort, of security, of belonging. Dinner went on as usual until the plates began to empty. I finished my meal slowly, careful with each bite. My hands were not as quick as they used to be, and I often lingered at the table after everyone else had eaten. When I finally set my fork down, I quietly picked up my plate and stood to take it to the sink. I thought I was doing the right thing, cleaning up after myself, easing the burden on my daughter-in-law. But before I could even reach the kitchen, my son's voice cut across the room. "Wash all your dirty dishes yourself," he snapped, his tone cold and commanding. I froze, startled. His words were sharp enough to make everyone at the table stop what they were doing. The children looked up, wide-eyed. His wife leaned back in her chair with a smirk tugging at her lips, as though she had been waiting for this moment. I looked at him, unsure if I had misheard. But then he added, with a sneer that turned my stomach, "And from now on, just eat the kids' leftovers. No point wasting food on you." The words struck me harder than any physical blow ever could. I felt my chest tighten, the air heavy in my lungs. My hands trembled, but I gripped the plate tightly so it wouldn't fall. For a moment, the entire room went silent, and I could feel every eye on me. My grandchildren, who once looked at me with admiration, now giggled nervously, following the cruel tone set by their father. Their laughter was like knives, small but cutting deep. I wanted to say something. I wanted to remind him of the nights I went to bed hungry so he could have a full plate. I wanted to tell him how many hours I had worked in factories, in construction, breaking my body to make sure he never had to feel the kind of hunger I knew as a child. I wanted to tell him that without me, he wouldn't even be sitting at this table, in this house, with this family. But the words never left my mouth. Instead, I stood there, plate in hand, swallowing my pride like a bitter stone. My daughter-in-law chuckled softly, hiding it behind her glass, but her eyes sparkled with satisfaction. My son leaned back in his chair, proud, as though he had finally put me in my place. The children laughed more openly now, repeating his words, "Eat the leftovers, Grandpa." I turned away, walking slowly to the sink. My face was calm, but inside, something broke. I washed the plate carefully, set it aside, and returned to my chair. I didn't look at anyone. I didn't speak. I simply sat in silence, chewing the pain over and over like a piece of dry bread. The rest of the dinner went on around me, but I was no longer present. The voices became distant, the laughter hollow. I stared at the table, my hands folded tightly together, my mind racing. Every sacrifice I had made, every coin I had saved, every drop of sweat I had shed, all of it felt erased in that one moment. To him, I was not a father. I was not a man. I was just another mouth to feed, an old body taking up space, an afterthought fit only for scraps. When the meal ended, I excused myself quietly and went to my room. I closed the door softly, careful not to make a sound, because even then, a part of me still clung to the habit of not disturbing others. I sat on the edge of the bed, my head in my hands, and I replayed his words again and again. "Eat the kids' leftovers." It echoed in my ears like a curse. That night, I didn't cry. My tears had dried years ago after losing my wife. Instead, I sat in silence, my dignity crumbling piece by piece. I thought of the pride I had once carried, the pride of being a father, a provider, a man who had built a future with his bare hands. And now, that pride was gone, reduced to the image of me sitting at a table where even my presence was mocked. But as the hours passed, something else began to grow in the silence of that room. Not anger, not hatred, something colder, sharper, resolve. My son had humiliated me in front of his wife, in front of his children, in front of myself. He thought he had stripped me of power. But what he had forgotten was the truth I had never spoken out loud. The house, the money, the inheritance. None of it was his yet. All of it was still mine. And while he laughed at me for being old and weak, he forgot that I still held the pen that could rewrite his future with a single stroke. That night, my dignity may have cracked, but something far stronger took its place. The decision that I would not leave this world mocked, disrespected, and silenced. I would leave it on my terms. And my son, the boy I once sacrificed everything for, would finally learn what silence can do when it chooses to speak. That night, I sat in my room long after the rest of the house had gone quiet. The sound of dishes clinking in the kitchen, the murmur of laughter from the living room, and the children's feet running up the stairs all faded one by one until there was nothing left but silence. Yet inside me, there was no peace. His words, "Wash your own dishes, eat the kids' leftovers," replayed again and again in my head like a cruel echo that refused to die. Each time I heard it, my chest tightened, my breath caught, and my hands trembled slightly, though I forced them to stay still. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor, and for the first time in many years, I felt smaller than I ever had in my life. All the pride I once carried as a father, as a man who had worked himself into the ground to raise his son, had been stripped from me with a single sentence at a dinner table. It wasn't just the command to wash dishes, or the insult of being told to eat scraps. It was the way he said it, the tone of dismissal, the coldness of authority, as though I were no longer his father, no longer a man worthy of respect, but simply another servant in his household. I closed my eyes, and memories came unbidden. Memories of my younger years, when I used to skip meals so that my boy could have more on his plate. I could still see myself sitting at the table in that small house where we once lived, pushing food toward him while I told him I wasn't hungry. I remembered nights when I came home exhausted from work, my back aching, my hands raw from labor, and still found the energy to cook for him, to wash his dishes, to clean the table so he would never feel the burden I carried. I thought of the pride I felt watching him eat, knowing he was full, knowing he was strong because of me. And now, that same boy had told me I wasn't worthy of a fresh plate of food. I thought of my late wife, and my heart ached even more. She had always told me, "One day, he will thank you. One day, he will see all you've done." She believed in gratitude, in family, in love passed down like an inheritance. But she wasn't here to see the truth, that her only child had grown cold, ungrateful, and cruel. I was glad she didn't have to hear those words at the dinner table. They would have killed her spirit faster than any illness. The pain wasn't only in what he said, but in what it revealed. It showed me that the boy I raised, the man I thought I knew, no longer existed. The son who once hugged me after school, who once looked up to me with wide eyes, was gone. In his place was a man who saw me as an old, useless burden, someone to mock in front of his wife and children. The realization was like a knife slowly twisting in my chest. I didn't cry that night. Tears wouldn't come, not because I wasn't hurt, but because the pain was too deep for them. Instead, I sat there, my face hard, my eyes dry, my body heavy. The silence of the room wrapped around me, suffocating. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock on the wall, every sound louder than usual in the emptiness. I wanted to scream, to shout, to demand respect, but the words lodged in my throat. And I realized something. I had been silent for years. Silent when he mocked me. Silent when he dismissed me. Silent when he made me feel like a guest in his home instead of a father. My silence had become habit, and it had allowed him to believe he could say anything, do anything, and I would just accept it. But as the night wore on, something began to shift inside me. At first, it was just a flicker, a faint thought that maybe I didn't have to endure this anymore. Then, slowly, it grew stronger. I remembered the truth I had kept tucked away, the money, the house, the inheritance, all of it was still in my name. He might think he controlled everything, but in reality, the power still sat quietly in my hands. While he laughed at me, while he humiliated me, he had forgotten that I was not powerless. I was not just an old man to be fed scraps. I was still the one who had built his life, and I still held the keys to his future. That thought gave me strength. The pain didn't fade, but it hardened into resolve. If he thought he could treat me as nothing, then I would show him what nothing truly meant. If he wanted me to eat scraps, then I would leave him with nothing but scraps of a broken legacy. By the time the clock struck midnight, I knew what I had to do. I wouldn't argue with him. I wouldn't shout. I wouldn't demand an apology that would never come. No, my revenge would be silent, cold, and absolute. He would never see it coming. And when the day arrived, he would understand exactly what it meant to strip a man of his dignity. I lay down in bed, my heart heavy, but my mind steady. For the first time that night, I felt a strange kind of calm. The pain was still there, but it was no longer aimless. It had direction. It had purpose. And that purpose was clear. I would make sure my son remembered me, not as the old man he mocked, but as the father who walked away in silence and took everything with him. As I lay awake the next morning, the weight of the night before still heavy in my chest, I thought about the reality of my situation. My son believed he had stripped me of dignity, reduced me to a beggar at his table. He thought his words were the final truth, that I was powerless, that I was nothing more than an old man clinging to scraps. But as I stared at the ceiling, a slow realization settled over me like dawn breaking after a long night. He had forgotten the truth, a truth I had kept quiet, tucked away in silence all these years, a truth that would soon remind him who I truly was. You see, everything he assumed belonged to him. The estate, the savings, the investments, the inheritance was not his. Not legally, not in reality. On paper, it was all still mine. The deeds, the accounts, the shares, the money that had been carefully built over decades of sacrifice. Every bit of it was still under my name. I had never transferred ownership, never handed it over, because a part of me had always believed I needed to hold on just in case. Maybe it was instinct, maybe it was wisdom, but whatever it was, it had preserved my power when I needed it most. He strutted around the house, proud, arrogant, acting as though he were the king of the family, the rightful heir to everything I had worked for. He mocked my presence, ordered me around, treated me as though I should be grateful for a roof over my head. But the irony, so sharp it almost made me laugh, was that the roof itself, the one above his family's heads, stood only because of me. Without my money, without my decisions, without my name still tied to the land and the inheritance, they had nothing. He had built his pride on an illusion, and he had no idea how fragile that illusion really was. As I sat there, the anger in my chest slowly turned into something else. Clarity. My son believed time had given him ownership, that by simply living long enough, he was entitled to everything. He forgot that respect is not inherited, that authority is not simply passed down without conditions. He thought my silence meant surrender. But in truth, my silence had been patience, patience that had now run out. I began to think about all the papers stored neatly in my locked drawer, the legal documents that bore my signature and mine alone, the will that still listed him as the sole heir, the accounts that still had my name as the only controller, the property deeds with no mention of him. All of it was waiting, untouched, as if holding its breath for this very moment. He may have treated me like a servant, but the truth was that with a single decision, I could remind him who truly held the power. And then another thought came, bitter and sharp. He wasn't just cruel to me. He had always mocked my stepson, his stepbrother. From the time they were young, he looked down on him, ridiculed him, called him names. He treated him like an outsider, someone unworthy of belonging to the family. I used to scold him for it, telling him to show kindness, but he never listened. The hatred stuck with him into adulthood. My son thought he was the only one who mattered, the only one who deserved my sacrifices. But what he never realized was that kindness is not given to the loudest voice. It is earned by the quiet respect of a heart that understands. And my stepson, the one he despised, had always shown me respect. He called me regularly, even when he didn't need anything. He listened to my stories, even the ones I had told 100 times. He treated me not as a burden, but as family. And in that contrast, the truth became even clearer. Love is not guaranteed by blood. Gratitude is not guaranteed by family. Respect must be earned. As these thoughts settled, I realized the decision had already been made inside me. My son's arrogance, his cruelty, his disregard had pushed me to the edge. But it was his forgetfulness, his blindness to the truth of who still held control, that sealed his fate. He had forgotten the truth, but I had not. I smiled faintly for the first time in many days. The power he thought he had over me was nothing but air. The real power sat quietly in my hands, waiting for me to use it. And soon, I would. Not with shouting, not with threats, but with ink on paper, signatures that could never be erased, decisions that could never be undone. He had told me to eat scraps, but I knew with absolute certainty now that it would be him left to pick at the scraps of a legacy he thought was his. The morning after that painful dinner, I woke up with a heaviness in my chest, but also with a kind of sharpness in my mind I hadn't felt in years. The humiliation still burned, but it was no longer aimless pain. It had transformed into resolve. I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time, staring at the sunlight creeping across the floor, and I knew I couldn't let things continue as they were. My son thought I was weak, powerless. finished. But he had forgotten the truth, and now it was time for me to remind him. I got dressed slowly, each button fastened with steady hands. It felt almost ceremonial, like I was preparing for something final, something that would change the course of everything. I slipped my documents into a folder, deeds, account statements, the old will, all proof of the power still in my possession. As I touched each paper, I felt my dignity slowly piecing itself back together. These weren't just documents. They were decades of sacrifice, the foundation of everything he took for granted. And they were still mine. By mid-morning, I picked up the phone and dialed the number of my lawyer, a man who had known me for years. His voice was calm and professional, but I could sense the surprise when I told him what I wanted. "I want to rewrite my will," I said firmly. There was no hesitation in my tone, no room for doubt. He asked me if I was sure, if this was what I truly wanted. And without a second thought, I said, "Yes, it's time." We scheduled a meeting for that very afternoon. I told my son I was going for a walk to the park, something I often did, so he wouldn't suspect anything. I left the house quietly, folder under my arm, and took a taxi straight to the lawyer's office. Each passing street outside the window felt like a step further away from weakness, a step closer to justice. When I arrived, I sat across from my lawyer in his office. He laid out the papers, and for a moment I stared at them in silence. This was it, the moment where I would decide the future of everything I had built. My son had assumed he would inherit it all. The $1.5 million I had saved, the properties, the estate. He thought it was already his, as if my life's work were just waiting for him to claim. But today, that illusion would shatter. With steady hands, I began giving instructions. His name, erased. His claim, removed. In his place, I named someone else. My stepson, the very one he had mocked, ridiculed, and hated all his life. I thought of the irony, the bitter twist of fate. The son who had called me useless, who told me to eat scraps, would one day learn that the fortune he thought was his had gone to the man he despised most. The one he looked down on would rise above him because of me. My lawyer asked me again, carefully, if this was truly my wish. He reminded me that such changes were permanent, legally binding, irreversible. I looked him straight in the eye and said, "Yes, I want this. My blood betrayed me. But respect was given to me by someone else, and that is where my legacy will go." My voice did not tremble. My heart did not waver. I signed the papers slowly, feeling the weight of each stroke of the pen. When the final signature was done, I set the pen down and leaned back in my chair. For the first time in years, I felt in control. My son could humiliate me at his table, but he could not erase me. I had taken back my power, not with anger, not with shouting, but with quiet action that would echo long after I was gone. We sealed the documents, filed them securely, and my lawyer assured me that everything was now official. My son had no claim, no legal right, no way to undo what had been written. I nodded, thanked him, and walked out of that office lighter than I had entered. The city air felt fresher, the sky brighter, as though the world itself knew a great burden had been lifted from me. On my way back, I thought of my stepson, the one my son had always hated, the one who, despite the coldness from his stepbrother, always treated me with kindness. I remembered how he would sit with me, ask about my health, check if I needed anything. He never once made me feel like a burden. To him, I wasn't an old man in the way. I was family. And it struck me then how fitting this decision was. Blood may tie people together, but it does not guarantee love. Respect, kindness, and gratitude matter more than blood ever could. By the time I returned home, I wore the same quiet face as always. My son asked casually where I had gone. "Just a walk," I said softly. He didn't suspect a thing. He smirked, handed me a bag of the children's scraps, and walked away. I took the bag calmly, But inside, I was smiling. He had no idea that the future he imagined had been stolen from him that very afternoon. That night, as I lay in bed, I replayed the moment of signing the papers. My humiliation at the dinner table had been real, painful, almost unbearable. But the power of what I had done was stronger. My silence had become my weapon. He thought I was powerless, but in reality, I had rewritten his destiny with one decision, one stroke of the pen. I closed my eyes and whispered to myself, "It's done. He will never know until it's too late." The days that followed were some of the strangest of my life. On the surface, everything looked exactly the same. I still rose early, still shuffled to the kitchen for my morning tea, still greeted my grandchildren with a faint smile as they ran through the house. To anyone watching, I was just the same old man, quiet, slow, invisible in his own home. But inside, I carried a secret, a powerful secret. The inheritance, the fortune, the estate, all of it had already slipped from my son's hands, though he had no idea. My silence had become a mask, and behind it, I was savoring the quiet justice of what I had done. Every time he barked at me, every time he sighed when I asked for help, every time his wife smirked at my expense, I no longer felt the sting of humiliation. Instead, I felt something else, a calm, steady satisfaction. They thought they were mocking me, breaking me down further, but I already knew the truth. They were laughing inside a house that would never be theirs. They were eating meals paid for by a man who had already taken their future away. Each insult became easier to bear because I understood what was coming. I moved through those days like an actor on a stage, performing the role of the old, submissive father. I washed my own dishes when told, scraped the leftovers onto my plate without complaint, and did the chores they left for me. Outwardly, I was obedient, compliant, almost defeated. But inside, I was smiling. I had become a shadow in their home, but one that held more power than they could ever imagine. I remember one particular evening, just a few days after signing the papers. My son came home from work and tossed his jacket on the chair. He looked at me sitting in the corner and said, "You should start going to bed earlier, Dad. You're always in the way when we're trying to watch TV." His wife chuckled softly at his words, and the children glanced at me with mocking smiles. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I simply nodded and left the room. But as I climbed the stairs to my small bedroom, I thought, "Laugh now, boy. One day soon, you'll realize you lost everything the moment you told me to eat scraps." This act of pretending gave me strength. Before, their words would crush me, keep me awake at night, make me question my worth. But now, every insult was like fuel for the fire of my quiet revenge. I didn't need to shout or confront them. I didn't need to demand respect. I had already secured the only justice that mattered. At night, when the house was finally quiet, I would sit at my small desk and open the drawer where I kept my papers. The sealed copy of the new will lay there, its weight heavier than gold in my eyes. I would touch it gently, almost reverently, reminding myself that the future was already written, and it was written without my son's name. Sometimes I would smile faintly in the dark, imagining his face when he would one day find out. The arrogance in his eyes replaced by shock, the smirk wiped clean, the laughter turning into silence. The greatest part of my disguise was how little effort it required. My son had already convinced himself that I was powerless, that I was nothing. He never questioned why I remained so quiet. He never suspected that behind my silence was a plan sharper than any words I could speak. His arrogance blinded him, and I used that blindness as my shield. Even my stepson, the one I had chosen as my true heir, didn't know yet. I had not told him because I wanted the moment of revelation to be complete, undeniable, final. When the truth came out, I wanted it to fall like a hammer, crushing the arrogance my son had built his life upon. Those days of pretending gave me something I hadn't felt in years: control. For so long, I had felt at the mercy of my son's temper, his cruelty, his dismissive words. But now, I was no longer a victim of his behavior. I was the quiet architect of his downfall, and he had no idea. Sometimes I would sit at the table and watch him laugh with his wife, boast about his plans, talk about the vacations he would take with his money, the investments he would make when I was gone. He spoke as though the inheritance was already his, as though I were just a formality waiting to die. And I would nod, keeping my face calm, while inside I whispered to myself, "Dream all you want. None of it will ever be yours." Every day that passed without him knowing was another victory. Every chore I did quietly, every insult I endured silently, was not submission. It was strategy. It was patience. It was the performance of a man who had already struck the deepest blow, one his son wouldn't even feel until it was far too late to undo. And in that disguise of normalcy, I found peace. I didn't need to fight him anymore. I didn't need to explain myself or beg for respect. I had already spoken the only words that mattered, not with my mouth, but with my pen. The plan was complete. All I had to do now was wait. The morning I chose to leave came without fanfare, without any announcement. It was quiet, simple, almost ordinary. But I knew it was the day my silence would take its final shape. I had rehearsed it in my mind 100 times. No goodbyes, no explanations, no second chances for them to wound me again. Just one clean departure, as invisible as the years they had tried to make me feel. I rose before dawn, the house still wrapped in darkness, everyone asleep in their rooms. The floorboards creaked softly under my feet as I moved, but no one stirred. I had already packed my suitcase the night before. Not much, just the essentials. Some clothes, my identification papers, my medicines, and the folder of documents that carried the weight of everything. That small suitcase held what little I needed to live, but it also carried the power that would one day destroy my son's illusions. I walked through the house slowly, my eyes tracing the familiar walls, the pictures of smiling faces hanging in the hallway. Photos of birthdays, holidays, family gatherings, moments that looked happy on the surface, but now felt hollow when I remembered the way they had treated me behind closed doors. I paused at one picture in particular. My son as a boy, sitting on my shoulders, both of us laughing. For a moment, my chest tightened, and I felt the sting of what might have been if he had grown into a different kind of man. But I shook my head. That boy was gone, replaced by the cruel, entitled man sleeping upstairs. I placed my keys on the table by the door. Those keys had once symbolized belonging, access to this house, to this family. But now, leaving them behind, felt like setting down chains. I didn't need them anymore. I would never walk through this door again. Outside, the air was cool, the world still half asleep. I pulled my coat tighter and walked down the street, suitcase rolling behind me. There was no car waiting, no family member to wave goodbye. Just me, an old man with tired eyes but a steady heart, stepping into the unknown with more dignity than I had felt in years. I reached the taxi stand just as the first light of dawn stretched across the sky. The driver loaded my bag into the trunk without question, and I gave him the name of a hotel 2 towns away. As the car pulled away, I looked back one last time. The house grew smaller in the distance, its windows still dark, unaware that the man they had mocked, dismissed, and humiliated was disappearing forever. During the drive, I sat quietly, my hands folded in my lap, my thoughts steady. There was no sadness now, no regret, only resolve. My son might wake later that morning, come downstairs, and wonder where I had gone. Perhaps he would think I was in the garden, or on one of my long walks. Maybe he wouldn't even notice my absence until much later in the day. But whenever he realized I was gone, he would not find me. And when he finally discovered the truth about the will, about the inheritance, it would be too late. At the hotel, I checked in under my own name, paid in cash, and settled into a small, clean room. It was nothing fancy, but it was mine. Mine alone. For the first time in years, I sat on a bed without feeling like a guest, without feeling unwanted, I brewed myself a cup of tea using the kettle in the room and drank it slowly, savoring the simple taste of independence. The next morning, I called my lawyer. My voice was calm as I gave him the final instructions. Deliver everything when the time is right. Make sure he understands there is no way back. The lawyer, ever professional, confirmed that everything was in order. The will was secure, the inheritance redirected, the house, the accounts, the properties, all tied up legally in ways my son could never touch. I hung up the phone, leaned back in the chair, and let out a long breath. It was done. There was no need for confrontation, no need for shouting matches or dramatic scenes. My disappearance itself was the loudest statement I could ever make. By walking away quietly, I was leaving behind not just a house, but the role of the humiliated old man they thought they controlled. And when the truth reached them, my silence would roar louder than any words I could have spoken. Days passed, and I did not call, did not write, did not leave any trace of where I had gone. The phone in my hotel room rang a few times, my son's number flashing on the screen, but I never answered. Let him wonder. Let him stew in confusion, in frustration. Every unanswered call was another reminder that he no longer had access to me, to my presence, to my power. I thought about him waking up in that house, walking through the rooms, maybe noticing the keys missing, maybe realizing the suitcase was gone. I imagined his anger turning to panic when he tried calling me, only to meet silence. And then, later, the true blow. The lawyer's letters arriving, delivering the reality that his inheritance had vanished, redirected to the very man he hated most. That moment, when arrogance turned into desperation, would be the justice I had waited for. And as I sat in that hotel room, sipping another cup of tea, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. The disappearance wasn't running away. It was reclaiming myself. For too long, I had been treated like a burden, like a leftover at the table. But now, I was no longer anyone's burden. I was my own man again. I didn't need their laughter. I didn't need their respect. I had already taken back my dignity, and I had left them only with the echo of my silence. The aftermath began slowly, like the distant rumble of a storm rolling in, and then, all at once, it broke violently. My son woke to find me gone, the keys sitting neatly on the table by the door, my suitcase missing from the corner of my room. At first, I imagine he must have brushed it off, perhaps thinking I had gone on one of my long walks, or maybe to the park as I often did. But as the hours stretched on, as he checked each room and found no sign of me, the unease would have grown. By midday, I believe panic had set in. His calls began. My phone rang again and again, his number flashing on the screen in my small hotel room. I never picked up. Sometimes I let it ring until the sound stopped. Other times, I silenced it immediately, watching in satisfaction as his attempts piled up unanswered. The voicemails came next, some angry, some pleading. "Dad, where are you? This isn't funny. Come home." Then the tone shifted. "What are you trying to prove? You can't just leave like this." And finally, desperation. "Please, just call me back. We'll talk." But I stayed silent. Silence was my answer. Silence was my power. It wasn't long before the lawyer's letters arrived at his house. I had instructed everything carefully, timed it so that by the time he realized I was truly gone, the legal truth would be waiting on his doorstep. The first letter was polite, professional, but firm. Notice of my decision to rewrite my will. The second confirmed the removal of his name. And the third, the one I know must have crushed him, detailed that the entire $1.5 million inheritance, along with the properties and accounts he thought were his, had been legally redirected to my stepson. I can picture the moment clearly in my mind, though I wasn't there. My son tearing open the envelope, scanning the words, his face draining of color as the reality struck him. His wife peering over his shoulder, her smirk finally wiped away. The children perhaps too young to understand, but old enough to sense the tension, the rage bubbling beneath the surface. He must have read the letters again and again, searching for a mistake, a loophole, some line of hope that it wasn't real. But it was real. It was final. And it was irreversible. The calls intensified after that. He left furious messages, his voice cracking with anger. "How could you do this to me, to your own son?" he shouted into the phone. "You think that stepson cares about you more than I do? He's nothing. I'm your blood." He said the word blood like it was supposed to mean something, like blood alone erased the years of humiliation he had poured on me. But blood means nothing without respect. Blood means nothing when all it carries is cruelty. Then came the begging. "Dad, please. I didn't mean what I said at dinner. I was stressed. I was tired. Just come back, we'll fix this. You can't cut me out." His voice trembled in those voicemails, the arrogance stripped away, replaced by fear. He knew he was losing everything, not just the money, not just the house, but the security he had always assumed would be his. He had built his pride on an inheritance he never actually owned, and now that foundation had crumbled beneath his feet. Neighbors began to notice. I heard later, through a distant relative, that he was embarrassed, forced to explain why strangers were showing up at the house, prospective buyers for the property he thought was his. He stormed into the lawyer's office more than once, demanding answers, only to be shown the signatures, the documents, the proof that it was all legal. Each time, he walked out angrier, smaller, more broken than before. His wife, once smug and superior, now questioned him at every turn, asking how he could have let this happen. The children, no longer laughing at their grandfather, watched their father unravel piece by piece. And through it all, I remained silent. I didn't need to argue with him. I didn't need to defend myself. The law, the documents, my decision, they spoke louder than any words I could ever shout. My revenge was already complete, not in loud confrontation, but in the quiet dismantling of his arrogance. I imagine him now, sitting in that house, the walls closing in, realizing the future he bragged about has slipped through his fingers. The vacations he promised his wife, the investments he boasted about, the easy life he thought was guaranteed. Gone. All because of one dinner, one insult, one act of cruelty that revealed who he truly was. And the irony that must eat at him most? That the fortune he lost didn't vanish into nothing. It went to his stepbrother, the man he hated most, the man he mocked and ridiculed all his life. Now, the balance of power had shifted forever. The one he looked down on now stood above him, wealthier, freer, more respected. That, perhaps, was the deepest cut of all. I sit now in my quiet room, far away, sipping tea as the phone vibrates with yet another missed call. I don't answer. I never will. My silence is my justice, my legacy. He thought he could humiliate me, reduce me to scraps. But in the end, it was he who was left scrambling for scraps of a broken future. The aftermath is simple. He lost everything, and I found peace. Now I live quietly, far away from the noise, the humiliation, and the coldness that once followed me in my own son's house. My new life is not grand, not filled with riches or luxury, but it is mine, and it is filled with peace. I wake each morning in a small, sunlit home where no one raises their voice at me, where no one looks at me with disdain. Here, every corner belongs to me, and every silence feels comforting instead of heavy. I spend my mornings walking slowly along quiet streets, sometimes stopping to sit on a bench and watch the world move by. No one rushes me, no one sighs in impatience at how long I take. In the afternoons, I read or I sit by the window with a cup of tea, letting the light fall across the pages of old books I've read many times before. At night, I cook for myself, not scraps or leftovers, but meals I prepare with care, even if simple. Every bite tastes like dignity because it comes without humiliation. Sometimes I think about my stepson, the man my son hated so much. He calls me now and then, always with respect in his voice, always asking how I am, never asking for anything in return. He visits when he can, bringing warmth and conversation, treating me not like a burden, but like family. And in those moments, I know I made the right choice. The legacy I worked my whole life to build went to someone who values it, and someone who values me. That, more than anything, brings me comfort. As for my son, I do not hate him. Hate is too heavy to carry in old age. I have simply let him go, just as I let go of the house, the inheritance, and the ties that once bound me in pain. He chose arrogance, he chose cruelty, and so I chose silence. That silence became the wall between us, a wall that cannot be broken now. He will live with the weight of his choices, just as I will live with the peace of mine. When I look back, I no longer see only the humiliation. I see the strength it gave me, the clarity it forced me to find. My son told me to wash my own dishes, to eat scraps from the plates of children. In that moment, he thought he was stripping me of dignity. But in truth, he was setting the stage for my final act of justice. And now, as I sit here in my quiet home, I feel no regret. My life's work will outlive me in hands that are grateful, not entitled. My days end in calm, not in shame. My final thought is simple. He wanted me to eat scraps. Instead, I left him with nothing but scraps of a broken legacy.